My son-in-law slid an envelope of cash across the table at a five-star restaurant and told me to disappear. He thought I was just a broke carpenter whose presence would embarrass him at his upcoming corporate gala. He looked at my worn boots and faded flannel shirt and saw a pathetic old man who had amounted to nothing. What he did not know was that I owned the blind trust that controlled the very company he was running as chief executive officer. He thought he was buying his way out of a social embarrassment. Instead, he just bought himself a front-row seat to his own absolute destruction. Let me tell you exactly how this arrogant fool dug his own grave. The air inside Le Gourmand was thick with the smell of expensive truffles, aged wine, and old money. It was the kind of restaurant in downtown Seattle where the menus did not have prices, and the waiters looked at you like they were evaluating your net worth. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, feeling the immediate shift in the atmosphere. I was wearing my 15-year-old faded red flannel shirt, a pair of dark denim jeans, and my scuffed Red Wing work boots. My hands were rough, permanently scarred and calloused from decades of hard labor. My late wife Mary always told me to wear my calluses with pride. She used to say that dirt under the fingernails was the mark of an honest man who built his life from the ground up. I held on to her words as the maitre d' stepped right into my path. He looked me up and down with barely disguised disgust, his nose crinkling, as if I had dragged mud into his pristine sanctuary. Before he could ask me to leave, a hand waved from a corner booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was Brad, my son-in-law. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than most people made in 3 months. Sitting next to him was my daughter, Sarah. She looked beautiful but incredibly tense, her eyes darting nervously between me and the other 2 people at the table. Those other 2 people were Richard and Patricia, Brad's parents. They were the epitome of high society snobs, people who had inherited wealth and spent their entire lives looking down on anyone who had to actually work for a living. I walked over to the table, my heavy boots thudding against the polished hardwood floor. Every head in the dining room turned to look at me. The whispers started immediately, soft murmurs of disapproval from the wealthy patrons who wondered how a vagrant had wandered past security. I did not care about them. I only cared about Sarah. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Richard did not offer his hand. He simply adjusted his silk tie and looked away. Patricia visibly flinched, pulling her quilted Chanel purse off the table and placing it on her lap as if my mere proximity might contaminate the leather. Sarah offered me a weak, trembling smile. She whispered a quiet hello, but her voice was strained. Brad did not even say good evening. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his red wine, placed the crystal glass down, and reached into his tailored jacket. He pulled out a thick brown craft envelope and pushed it across the glass table. It stopped right in front of my plate. I looked at the envelope, then up at Brad. His face was set in a smug, condescending smirk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke in a low, cold voice. "There is $20,000 in that envelope, William. It is all in crisp, untraceable $100 bills. It is more than enough for you to pack up your things, leave Seattle, and move into a budget retirement community down in Florida. I have the Apex Industries CEO gala next week. The governor will be there. The top financial press will be there. I simply cannot have the media snapping photographs of my father-in-law looking like a homeless drifter who wandered in off the street. You are an embarrassment to my public image, and it is time for you to go." The absolute audacity of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. $20,000. To him, it was a massive sum, a generous bribe to rid himself of a peasant. He thought he was being charitable. He thought he was flexing his immense financial power over a broke, retired carpenter. The irony of the situation was so profound, it almost made me laugh out loud. I looked down at my rough, scarred hands. These were the hands that had poured the very concrete for the first Apex warehouse 40 years ago. I had built the company from a single pickup truck into a multi-billion-dollar global logistics empire. When Mary died 10 years ago, I lost my desire to sit in boardrooms. I quietly stepped down, placed my controlling shares into a blind trust, and hired the best lawyers in the country to keep my identity entirely anonymous. I appointed a proxy board to handle the daily operations, and I went back to living the simple, quiet life Mary and I had always loved. Brad was hired by my board 3 years ago. He had no idea who I was. To him, Sarah was just a middle-class girl, and I was just her pathetic blue-collar father. Richard let out a sharp, mocking chuckle as he cut into his rare steak. "You really should take it, old man," he said, not even bothering to look up from his plate. "A carpenter like you has probably never seen that kind of cash in one place before. You could finally afford to buy clothes that do not smell like sawdust and cheap soap. Consider it an act of extreme charity from my son." Patricia took a delicate sip of her champagne and chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "It really is for the best, William. We belong to a different class of society. Brad has a reputation to uphold. Having you around driving that hideous old truck of yours, wearing those awful clothes, it damages the Apex brand. You simply do not fit into our world. Take the money and let these kids live their lives without you holding them back." I did not yell. I did not flip the table. I did not defend myself. When you have spent 40 years fighting corporate sharks and building an empire, you learn that anger is a weakness. Silence is power. I slowly reached out and placed my hand over the thick envelope. The paper was rough. I felt the stacks of bills inside. I looked at Sarah. My daughter was staring at her lap, her knuckles completely white from gripping her napkin. She was paralyzed by fear, completely dominated by her husband and his arrogant family. Mary had begged me on her deathbed to protect our little girl from the viciousness of the world. I had tried to shield her by hiding our wealth, by letting her live a normal life. But in doing so, I had left her vulnerable to a predator like Brad. I picked up the envelope and slipped it into the inner pocket of my faded jacket. Brad smiled, a triumphant, victorious grin spreading across his face. He thought I had surrendered. He thought he had bought my dignity for $20,000. He leaned back in his chair, extremely satisfied with himself. "Good choice, William. I will have my assistant book you a coach ticket to Miami tomorrow morning." I reached into my front pocket, pulled out a wrinkled $20 bill, and dropped it onto my empty porcelain plate. "That is for my tap water," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any emotion. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and looked down at the three of them. "Enjoy your wine, Brad." I turned around and walked away, my heavy boots echoing through the silent dining room. I did not look back. But just as the heavy glass doors of the restaurant closed behind me, I heard the violent, desperate screech of a wooden chair scraping against the floor. The cold Seattle rain hit my face as I stepped onto the pavement. The city lights blurred in the wet mist. I pulled up the collar of my jacket, the weight of the envelope pressing against my chest. Before I could reach my old Ford pickup, I heard rapid footsteps splashing through the puddles behind me. "Dad. Wait. Please, wait." I turned around. Sarah was running toward me, holding her evening gown up to avoid the puddles. She was shivering the rain instantly, ruining her carefully styled hair. She threw her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. "Dad. I am so sorry," she cried, her voice trembling. "Please do not hate him. Please do not listen to what they said. He does not mean it, Dad. He is just under so much pressure right now." I held my daughter tightly, feeling the frailness of her frame. "Sarah," I said softly, "he just tried to pay me to leave the state. That is not stress. That is cruelty." "No, you do not understand," she pleaded, looking up at me with desperate, tear-filled eyes. "The board of directors at Apex is threatening his job. They are ruthless, Dad. The sales pressure is crushing him. He is working 80 hours a week trying to keep the company afloat. He is terrified of losing everything. He just projects his anger sometimes. He actually told me last night that he is worried about your health. He thinks the cold Seattle rain is bad for your lungs. He said Florida would be a better environment for you. He just has a terrible way of showing it." I stood there in the pouring rain, looking into the eyes of my innocent daughter, and a deep, sickening realization washed over me. I played the part of the forgiving, naive father. I nodded slowly, patting her back. "Okay, sweetheart. I understand. Do not cry. I am not mad." But internally my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. The lie she just fed me shattered everything. I am the anonymous chairman of the board of directors. I read the financial reports every single morning. There was absolutely no sales pressure. Apex Industries had just reported record-breaking third-quarter profits. The company was swimming in cash. The board had sent Brad an email just yesterday praising his quarterly margins. No one was threatening his job. If he was not stressed from work, why was he acting so desperate? Why was he so desperate to get me completely out of the state before the CEO, Gala, a sharp, aggressive honk, cut through the rain? A sleek, midnight black Porsche Panamera pulled up to the curb, tires splashing water onto the sidewalk. The passenger window rolled down. Brad leaned over from the driver's seat, his face contorted in rage. "Sarah, get in the car right now," he yelled, ignoring my presence entirely. "You are ruining your dress. Get in." Sarah flinched instinctively, pulling away from me like a frightened child. "I love you, Dad," she whispered before turning and hurrying toward the sports car. As she opened the door, the street lamp illuminated the interior of the Porsche. Brad gripped the steering wheel tightly in frustration. And in that brief second, the light caught the metal on his left wrist. He was wearing a Patek Philippe Grand Complication. It is a masterpiece of Swiss engineering recognizable only to those who truly understand high-end luxury. I knew exactly what that watch was because I owned one just like it sitting in a vault. It cost $250,000. Brad's official salary as the CEO of Apex was $500,000 a year. Even with performance bonuses, there was absolutely no way a corporate employee could afford a $250,000 watch and a brand new Porsche Panamera without drowning in massive debt. Or worse. Sarah closed the car door, and the Porsche roared away into the dark, rainy streets, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick envelope of cash. My gut feeling, honed by decades of fighting off corporate espionage and financial predators, told me everything I needed to know. He was not stressed. He was not protecting his public image. He was stealing. He was bleeding my company dry, and he needed the only person who truly cared about Sarah out of the picture before everything collapsed. I looked at the taillights of his car disappearing into the night. He thought he had successfully removed me from the chessboard, but he had no idea that he had just woken up a sleeping wolf. I walked back to my rusty pickup truck, threw the envelope onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. It was time to find out exactly how deep this rot went. The morning air was crisp and biting as I stood in my modest kitchen, carefully pouring hot, homemade chicken soup into a battered steel thermos. It was the exact recipe my late wife Mary used to make whenever our daughter Sarah felt overwhelmed by the weight of the world. Today, it was my perfect, innocent excuse. I was just a doting poor father-in-law deeply concerned about the immense corporate stress that was supposedly crushing his hard-working son-in-law. I screwed the lid onto the thermos, grabbed my worn canvas jacket, and headed out to the driveway. My 1998 Ford pickup truck groaned as the engine turned over. It was a reliable, rusted beast that had been with me through decades of hard labor. I drove through the bustling streets of downtown Seattle, the massive skyscrapers, casting long, cold shadows over the pavement. Eventually, I pulled up to the towering glass and steel monolith that served as the global headquarters of Apex Industries. The sheer scale of the building was breathtaking, a modern fortress of wealth and power that dominated the city skyline. I parked my old truck in a public lot a few blocks away, paid the meter with crumpled bills, and walked back toward the main entrance. I clutched the thermos tightly against my chest, ready to play the role of the clueless, affectionate old man who only wanted to help his family. I stepped through the automated revolving doors and was immediately hit by the scent of polished marble, expensive leather, and conditioned air. The lobby of Apex Industries was designed to intimidate. It was vast, pristine, and aggressively modern with soaring ceilings and perfectly manicured indoor trees. At the far end of the lobby stood an expansive, curved reception desk, carved from imported black granite. I walked across the flawless floor, my heavy work boots squeaking slightly against the polished stone. Behind the desk sat a young, immaculately groomed receptionist. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer and a headset, her fingers flying across a sleek computer keyboard. As I approached the desk, she slowly raised her eyes. Her professional, welcoming smile vanished the instant she took in my appearance. She looked at my faded flannel shirt, my frayed denim jeans, and the dented steel thermos in my hands. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together in a tight knot of profound disapproval. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with frigid condescension. She spoke to me slowly, articulating her words as if she believed I might not understand English, or perhaps lacked the basic intellect to comprehend her. I offered her a warm, grandfatherly smile, leaning slightly against the cold granite counter. "Good morning, miss," I said politely. "I am here to see Brad. He is the chief executive officer. I am his father-in-law, William. I brought him some hot soup. My daughter told me he has been working extremely late hours, and I just wanted to drop this off to make sure he is eating properly." The receptionist stared at me in absolute silence for a long, painful moment. She looked from my face down to the thermos, and then back up to my face. A look of sheer, unadulterated revulsion settled over her features. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, scolding whisper, "the executive floor is strictly off-limits to unannounced visitors. Mr. Brad does not accept personal deliveries, and he certainly does not eat homemade food brought in from the street." I kept my pleasant smile firmly in place, refusing to let her hostility break my carefully constructed character. "Oh, I understand he is very busy right now," I replied gently. "But if you could just give his office a quick call, I am sure he would be happy to step down for just a moment. It will only take a second of his valuable time." The receptionist let out a sharp, impatient sigh. She did not reach for her phone. Instead, she pressed a small button hidden beneath the counter. "Sir, I am going to have to ask you to step away from the desk. You are making our corporate clients uncomfortable." Before I could respond, I heard the heavy, synchronized footsteps of two large security guards approaching from behind. They were dressed in sharp, dark suits with earpieces discreetly tucked into their collars. They positioned themselves on either side of me, their stances wide and intimidating. "Is there a problem here?" one of the guards asked, glaring down at me with hard, authoritative eyes. The receptionist gestured toward me with a manicured hand. "This gentleman is loitering and refuses to leave the premises. Please escort him out immediately." The guard closest to me placed a heavy, firm hand on my shoulder. "You need to leave the building right now, old man," he ordered, his grip tightening aggressively. "If you want to leave a package for an employee, you have to use the service entrance and wait in the loading dock area in the basement. If you refuse to comply, we will be forced to call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I looked at the guard, then at the receptionist, absorbing their utter contempt. It took every ounce of my self-control not to pull out my phone, dial the private line of the executive board, and fire all three of them on the spot. But I needed to maintain my cover. I needed to see exactly what Brad was hiding from the world. I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump to perfectly mimic the posture of a defeated, intimidated elder. "I am so sorry," I whispered, clutching the thermos tighter. "I did not mean to cause any trouble today. I will go to the loading dock. Please do not call the police." The guards escorted me down a barren, dimly lit concrete stairwell, leading me far away from the glamorous public spaces of the building. They left me in a drafty, echoing service hallway, deep in the basement, pointing to a cold, concrete bench near the loading bays. "Wait there," one of them barked before walking away. "Do not wander around." I sat down on the freezing concrete, placing the thermos quietly on my lap. The air down here smelled of engine exhaust and damp cardboard. I looked up at the wall opposite the bench. Painted on the gray cinder block was the massive stylized logo of Apex Industries. I stared at those sharp, intersecting geometric lines. 40 years ago, I had sketched that exact logo on a cheap paper napkin in a crowded, greasy diner. I had built this entire empire from absolutely nothing, pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into every single foundation. Now I was sitting in the damp basement of my own building, treated like a criminal vagrant by the very people whose paychecks I funded. The dark irony of the situation settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I sat in the deep shadows of the service corridor for nearly an hour, completely unseen and forgotten by the corporate world bustling above me. The loading dock was extremely quiet, the delivery trucks having already finished their morning routes. Just as I was beginning to wonder if my trip had been entirely in vain, a soft, distinct chime echoed through the stagnant air. It was the sound of the private VIP elevator arriving at the basement level. The polished steel doors slid open with a smooth mechanical hiss. I pressed my back firmly against the cold concrete pillar, concealing myself entirely within the shadows. Two men stepped out of the elevator, their expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor. One was Brad. The other was a man I instantly recognized from the corporate dossiers as the chief financial officer of Apex Industries. They stopped just a few feet away from my hiding spot, believing they were entirely alone in the darkness. Their voices echoed loudly against the cold concrete walls, completely unaware that the man who owned their entire world was standing right there. I held my breath. I pressed my back flat against the rough, cold concrete of the support pillar. The damp chill of the basement seeped through my thin flannel shirt, but I barely felt it. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, praying that the shadows cast by the flickering fluorescent lights would be enough to conceal my presence. I remained absolutely motionless, blending into the dark, industrial background of the loading dock. Brad and the chief financial officer stepped further out of the polished steel elevator. Their expensive Italian leather shoes clicked in a steady, arrogant rhythm against the stained cement floor. They stopped just a few yards away from my hiding spot. I could smell the sharp citrus notes of Brad's overpriced cologne cutting through the stagnant, dusty air of the basement. I slowly turned my head just enough to peek around the rough edge of the concrete pillar. Brad was pacing back and forth, his hands running frantically through his perfectly styled hair. The chief financial officer, a tall, slender man with a sharp, predatory face, stood completely still, holding a sleek black leather tablet. They both looked incredibly tense, vibrating with a toxic, nervous energy that had absolutely nothing to do with standard corporate pressure. They thought they were securely hidden in the bowels of the building, far away from the prying eyes of their employees and the corporate board. They thought they were untouchable. Brad stopped pacing and turned sharply toward the financial officer. His voice echoed loudly against the cold, concrete walls, sharp and deeply panicked. "Listen to me very carefully," Brad snapped, his tone dripping with venom and desperation. "You just need to bury the $5 million deficit deeply into the employee pension fund. Do it today. Do it before the quarterly audit closes." The financial officer shifted uncomfortably, clutching his tablet tighter against his chest. He warned Brad that moving that much capital out of the retirement accounts would trigger internal alarms if anyone bothered to look closely at the automated ledgers. Brad let out a harsh, barking laugh that chilled my blood. He waved his hand dismissively in the air. "Those blue-collar idiots down on the warehouse floor are never going to check the complex financial ledgers," he sneered, his voice echoing with absolute contempt. "They just clock in sweat for their hourly wages and go home to their pathetic little lives. They will not even notice the money is missing until they try to retire 20 years from now. You just hide the paper trail behind the shell corporations we set up last month." The financial officer still looked incredibly nervous. He asked what would happen if the anonymous chairman of the board ordered an independent review of the pension allocations. Brad smiled, a cold, calculating grin that transformed his handsome face into something truly monstrous. "By the time that coward of an anonymous chairman figures out the money is completely gone, I will be safely sitting in Zurich." The corporate gala is next week. Once the merger paperwork is signed and the final wire transfers clear the offshore accounts, we are done here. I am not spending the rest of my life slaving away for a company owned by a phantom. Make the transfer today and make absolutely sure my father-in-law is on a plane to Florida by Monday. I need Sarah completely isolated and vulnerable when the final phase of the plan happens. I stood frozen behind the concrete pillar, my hands gripping the dented steel thermos so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The warm chicken soup inside the container suddenly felt like a heavy, mocking weight in my hands. The plausible lie my daughter Sarah had fed me last night, in the freezing rain, shattered completely into a million irreparable pieces. Brad was not struggling under the crushing weight of executive sales pressure. He was not a dedicated, hard-working husband lashing out because he was stressed by his demanding corporate responsibilities. He was an absolute parasite. He was actively, maliciously embezzling the hard-earned pensions of the very workers I had spent my entire adult life protecting. Those blue-collar idiots he was mocking were the loyal, dedicated men and women who had built Apex Industries alongside me. They were the forklift drivers, the warehouse managers, the shipping coordinators who had trusted this company to secure their futures and feed their families. I had placed my company into a blind trust to ensure it would continue to provide for those honest, hard-working people long after I stepped down. Now this arrogant, greedy predator was casually draining their life savings to fund his escape to Switzerland. But what sent a truly terrifying chill down my spine was his final sentence. He needed Sarah completely isolated and vulnerable when the final phase of the plan happened. He was not just stealing money. He was planning something infinitely darker, something that directly threatened the life of my only child. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was staggering. He had looked me dead in the eye at that fancy French restaurant, handed me $20,000, and treated me like a worthless beggar, all while he was actively stealing millions from my own vault and planning to harm my daughter. A hot, blinding wave of pure, unfiltered wrath began to rise from the deepest part of my soul. I did not feel like a weak, retired 78-year-old man anymore. I felt like a furious father and a ruthless corporate founder ready to completely decimate the enemies inside his gates. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to calm down. I needed to let them finish their conversation. I needed to gather every single piece of information before I launched my counterattack. Brad and the financial officer continued to discuss the intricate details of their offshore wire transfers, their voices gradually lowering as they walked back toward the polished steel doors of the VIP elevator. I remained perfectly still, waiting for the heavy doors to slide shut and carry them back up to their executive suites. I kept my eyes locked on the gray cinder block wall, my mind racing through 100 different strategies to lock down the pension funds and freeze Brad out of the internal banking system. I was so lost in my dark, calculating thoughts that I did not hear the secondary doors open at the far end of the loading dock. I did not hear the soft, deliberate footsteps approaching my hiding spot until it was much too late. Suddenly, the sharp click of a designer high heel echoed aggressively against the solid concrete floor right behind my back. The sound sliced through the quiet air of the basement like a razor blade. My body tensed. I slowly turned around, tightening my grip on the steel thermos. Standing there just a few feet away from me was Patricia, Brad's mother. Her arms were crossed tightly over her cashmere coat, and she was glaring at me with a look of pure venom. She did not say a word at first. She stood there looking like a vulture wrapped in expensive designer clothing. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated her face. Her eyes raked over my faded flannel shirt, rough denim jeans, and scuffed work boots. The disgust radiating from her was intense. I stood up straight, shifting my weight, fully prepared to play the role of the confused, intimidated old man. But before I could offer an innocent excuse for being down there, she lunged forward. Her movements were surprisingly fast. She reached out and violently snatched the dented steel thermos right out of my calloused hands. Her manicured fingernails scraped painfully against my rough skin. I let her take it. I did not fight back, maintaining my absolute submission. She held the thermos away from her pristine coat, as if it were a container filled with toxic waste. Her nose wrinkled in profound revulsion as she looked at the modest vessel that held the hot chicken soup I had prepared. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper that echoed against the concrete walls. "Are you stalking my son now? You think you can wander into his corporate headquarters carrying this disgusting garbage to stink up his professional environment?" I kept my expression perfectly neutral, projecting a mask of mild confusion. "I just wanted to bring him some lunch, Patricia," I said softly, ensuring my voice sounded appropriately weak. "Sarah mentioned he was working very hard. I only wanted to help." Patricia let out a short, brutal laugh. "Help? You honestly think a pathetic nobody like you could possibly help a man of my son's immense stature?" She took a step back, her eyes darting around the loading dock to ensure we were completely alone. Then, with a look of sheer malice, she walked over to a massive industrial trash bin sitting against the cinderblock wall. She held my thermos out over the open rim. "You do not belong here, William," she spat, her voice echoing with ruthless superiority. "And neither does your pathetic peasant garbage." She opened her hand and dropped the thermos. The heavy steel container hit the bottom of the empty industrial bin with a loud clang that resonated through the quiet basement. The sound made my jaw clench. That was the exact recipe my late wife used to make. It was a symbol of genuine care, discarded like literal refuse by a woman whose entire existence was built on vanity and stolen wealth. A surge of hot anger flared in my chest. I wanted to tell her that she was standing inside my building. I wanted to show her the financial ledgers proving that her precious son was nothing but a common thieving criminal. I wanted to crush her towering arrogance, but the discipline of a lifetime kept me perfectly anchored. I forced my breathing to remain steady. I needed them to feel comfortable in their false sense of dominance. I needed them to believe I was entirely broken. Patricia did not stop there. She closed the distance between us, stepping aggressively into my personal space. The overpowering scent of her suffocating floral perfume washed over me, masking the familiar smells of engine exhaust and damp cardboard. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, stopping just an inch short of touching my faded shirt. "Listen to me very carefully, because I will only say this one time," she threatened, her voice dropping into a low growl. "If you do not take that $20,000 and leave this state permanently by Monday morning, I will personally see to it that you are arrested. I will call the police myself and press formal charges for stalking harassment and criminal trespassing." I stared down at her, maintaining my silent, submissive facade. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch to feed her massive, inflated ego. "We are high society, William," she continued, her eyes wide with obsessive pride. "We are the elite class of this city. My son is a visionary corporate leader, and my family represents success, power, and flawless prestige. You are nothing but a dirty, embarrassing stain on our beautiful family portrait. You are dragging my son down. You are holding your own daughter back from achieving true greatness. You are a relic of a worthless life that they are desperately trying to escape. If you truly loved Sarah, you would take the cash, get on a plane, and let her live without the depressing burden of a failure for a father. Do you understand me?" The pure, unfiltered evil in her words was astounding. She truly believed every single syllable she was saying. She actually thought that her family possessed inherent superiority simply because they wore expensive clothing and drank expensive wine. She had absolutely no idea that the luxury she was so desperately protecting was currently being funded by the retirement savings of innocent, hardworking people. She had no idea that her son was planning a sinister escape to Switzerland. And most importantly, she had no idea that she was currently threatening a man who possessed enough financial power to ruin her entire bloodline. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch, and I did not step away from her pointing finger. Instead, I slowly and deliberately turned my back on her. I walked the few short steps over to the massive industrial trash bin. I reached my calloused hands down into the dark container and carefully retrieved my dented steel thermos. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice spiking with sudden irritation. "Did you not just hear a single word I said to you?" I ignored her for a moment. I pulled the thermos out of the bin and brushed a few pieces of dust off the cold metal surface. I pulled a cotton handkerchief from my pocket and meticulously wiped down the outside of the container. I made sure every single inch of it was clean. Only when I was completely satisfied did I turn back to face her. I did not slouch my shoulders anymore. I stood up to my full height, towering over her small defensive frame. I let the mask of the confused, intimidated old man drop completely. For the very first time since she had met me, I let her see the ruthless, calculating corporate founder hiding beneath the faded flannel shirt. I looked dead into her eyes with the chilling calm of an apex predator that had just cornered its incredibly naive prey. The sudden shift in my physical posture and the cold stillness in my eyes made her instantly falter. The aggressive smirk vanished from her heavily powdered face. She instinctively took a small, uncertain step backward, her expensive high heel catching slightly on the uneven concrete floor. She suddenly realized she was standing in a dark, empty basement with a man who was no longer acting like a victim. "You are right, Patricia," I said, my voice incredibly low, smooth, and dangerously soft. "Things around here have gotten terribly dirty." I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance she had just tried to create. I held the clean steel thermos loosely by my side. I did not blink as I held her fearful, shifting gaze. I knew this moment would be etched into my memory forever. I will make absolutely sure the trash is completely taken out by next week. I did not wait for her to respond. I did not give her the opportunity to utter another venomous word. I simply turned around and walked away, my heavy work boots echoing with a steady, rhythmic finality down the long, dark corridor of the basement. I left her standing entirely alone in the shadows, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was about to descend upon her entire world. I left Apex Industries and drove quickly back to my suburban home. The encounter with Patricia cemented my resolve. They wanted me gone, and I would give them exactly what they asked for, but entirely on my terms. I walked into my bedroom and pulled an old canvas suitcase from the closet. It was the same olive green bag I carried when I moved to Seattle 50 years ago. I packed a few flannel shirts, some denim jeans, and my shaving kit. I needed to play the ultimate fool. I needed to convince Brad and his malicious parents that their bribe had worked perfectly. They had to believe I was a broken old man, quietly retreating to a retirement community in Florida to fade away into total obscurity. An hour later, I heard tires on my gravel driveway. It was Sarah. She insisted on driving me to the Amtrak station, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of our lives. I carried my bag to the porch and locked the door. Sarah ran up the wooden steps and threw her arms around my neck. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She wore a simple gray sweater, looking incredibly fragile and exhausted. The corporate life she shared with Brad was draining her vibrant energy. I held her closely, feeling the familiar warmth of my only child, and a profound agony washed over my entire being. Hugging her goodbye was the hardest thing I have ever done in my 78 years. My paternal instincts were screaming at me to lock her inside my house and protect her from the absolute monster she had married. I wanted to tell her she was the sole heir to a billion-dollar empire, that her husband was a greedy predator, and that she never had to endure his psychological abuse again. But I had to stay completely silent. If I struck now without proper preparation, Brad would panic. He would immediately transfer the stolen funds into untraceable offshore accounts and hire an army of defense attorneys. I needed to be patient. I needed the trap to snap shut perfectly around him, leaving him absolutely no room to escape. I pulled away from our embrace and offered a reassuring smile. "Do not cry, sweetheart," I said gently, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "Florida will be good for my old bones. The damp Seattle weather has been getting too harsh for me lately anyway. I will find a quiet place near the beach and spend my days fishing. You just focus on taking care of yourself." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. She took the handle of my battered suitcase, insisting on carrying it to her car. We walked slowly down the driveway together. Before we got into her vehicle, I reached into the front pocket of my jeans and pulled out the brass key to my Ford pickup. I placed it gently into her palm. "I want you to keep this safe for me," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "Your mother loved that old truck. It might not look like much to the rest of the world, but it has a lot of good miles left in it." Sarah clutched the key tightly against her chest, fresh tears welling up. "I will take perfect care of it, Dad," she promised me. We got into her car and began the quiet drive toward the downtown Amtrak station. The heavy rain had reduced to a steady drizzle. I spent the journey looking out the window, memorizing passing streets, and mentally reviewing my impending war strategy. Sarah kept casting worried glances in my direction, clearly burdened by deep guilt. She truly believed she was failing me, allowing her arrogant husband to push her father out of her life. I hated causing her this temporary pain, but it was a necessary sacrifice to secure her permanent freedom. We arrived at the train station just as boarding calls echoed through the overhead speakers. The massive terminal was crowded with rushing travelers and heavy luggage carts. We stood near the departure gate for my southbound train. Sarah hugged me one last time, holding on tightly, as if afraid to let go. "Have a safe trip, Dad," she whispered against my shoulder. "Please call me the minute you arrive in Florida." I promised her I would. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and turned toward the boarding platform. I did not look back until I had found my assigned seat next to a large, smudged window. I sat down and looked out through the thick glass. Sarah was standing alone on the wet concrete platform, her hands tucked deeply into her pockets to fend off the biting cold. She offered a small, hesitant wave. I waved back, maintaining my gentle smile. I kept my eyes locked on her as the heavy diesel engine roared to life. The train jerked forward slowly, pulling away from the busy station. I watched my beautiful, innocent daughter slowly shrink into the distance until she finally turned and walked back toward the parking garage. She was going straight back to a house shared with a thief, unaware of the immense danger surrounding her. My heart ached, but my mind was incredibly focused. As the train rattled along the tracks, the rhythmic clacking pulling me further away from the city center, my mind drifted back to the very beginning. 40 years ago, Seattle was not the polished, tech-driven metropolis it is today. It was a gritty, hard-working port city, and I was just a young man with a pregnant wife, a second-hand toolbox, and a head full of ambitious dreams. I remembered the blistering summer afternoons pouring the concrete for our very first modest warehouse down by the docks. The sweat would sting my eyes and my back would ache so fiercely by the evening that I could barely stand up straight. But Mary would always be there waiting with a cold glass of lemonade and that radiant, unwavering smile that made every ounce of pain completely worthwhile. We built Apex Industries on a foundation of trust handshake deals and an unyielding commitment to our employees. Back then, if a forklift driver could not make rent because his kid got sick, I advanced his paycheck out of my own pocket. We were a family. The men and women who wore the Apex uniform knew that the company had their backs, and in return, they gave me their absolute loyalty. That mutual respect propelled us from a single rusted pickup truck to a regional fleet, and eventually to a global logistics empire. Brad knew absolutely nothing about that kind of sacrifice. He was born into the suffocating privilege of high society, a world where hands never blistered and boots never saw a day of real mud. He looked at a balance sheet and saw only numbers, completely blind to the human lives attached to every decimal point. He viewed our loyal warehouse workers not as the lifeblood of the company, but as exploitable, disposable assets. The sheer arrogance of his perspective disgusted me to my very core. He thought corporate leadership was about expensive Italian suits, aggressive boardroom takeovers, and sipping $500 wine while looking down at the city from a glass tower. He did not understand that true leadership meant carrying the heaviest burden so your people did not have to. As I watched the gray, rain-soaked trees blur past the train window, a cold, hardened resolve settled deep into my bones. I was not just fighting to save my daughter anymore. I was fighting to reclaim the soul of the company Mary and I had sacrificed our entire youth to build. I would not let a spoiled, greedy parasite burn our legacy to the ground. I leaned back against the stiff fabric of the train seat and closed my eyes. The rhythmic clacking of the metal wheels against the steel tracks was the only sound in my carriage. I did not intend to go to Florida. I did not plan to retreat into the shadows and live out my remaining years in quiet obscurity. I was merely creating the perfect illusion. Brad and his venomous mother wanted me out of the city so they could execute their dark corporate maneuvers without my interference. I was giving them the exact space they desperately desired. They would become comfortable, arrogant, and extremely careless. I sat perfectly still for exactly 12 minutes. I watched the dense urban landscape of downtown Seattle gradually fade into the damp, forested outskirts of the city. The train moved steadily along the winding coastal tracks. The moment the intercom crackled to life, announcing our arrival at the very next commuter station, just 10 miles down the line, I immediately stood up from my seat. I grabbed my olive green bag from the overhead compartment and walked purposefully toward the exit doors. The train hissed to a halt at a desolate suburban platform. The doors slid open, letting in a freezing gust of Pacific Northwest wind. I stepped down onto the cold, rain-slicked concrete, gripping the handle of my bag tightly. The massive train blew its heavy horn and quickly pulled away, leaving me standing entirely alone in the gloomy, overcast afternoon. I pulled my faded jacket tightly around my shoulders to block the biting wind and walked toward the empty passenger drop-off zone. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my burner phone, and dialed a secure number. A sleek, heavily tinted black town car pulled around the corner just seconds later, stopping precisely at the curb right in front of me. I opened the heavy rear door of the town car and slid into the plush leather interior. The driver did not ask for a destination. He simply nodded, merged smoothly back into the evening traffic, and accelerated toward the towering skyline of downtown Seattle. The rain began to fall again, streaking across the tinted windows as we navigated the slick urban streets. I watched the city blur past my mind, organizing the pieces of the trap I was about to set. Brad and Patricia thought they had successfully banished a pathetic, helpless old man to the coastal swamps of Florida. They believed their little corporate kingdom was perfectly secure. They were about to learn a very brutal lesson about the true nature of power. The town car glided to a seamless halt in front of a heavily fortified monolithic glass building. This was not a public commercial tower. It was a private, highly exclusive fortress of legal and financial maneuvering, home to the most ruthless corporate law firm on the entire West Coast. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked purposefully toward the grand entrance. The massive glass doors were flanked by 2 armed security personnel in tailored suits. They moved to intercept me, their eyes instantly locking onto my faded flannel shirt, my wet denim jeans, and my scuffed work boots. Before they could even raise their hands to stop my progress, the head of building security rushed out from behind the front desk. His face was completely pale. He frantically waved the guards down aggressively, gesturing for them to step back and clear a path for me. I walked straight past them without breaking my stride. The grand lobby was a sprawling expanse of imported Italian marble, brushed steel, and imposing modern art. It was designed to make ordinary men feel incredibly small. Scattered across the waiting areas were billionaires, tech moguls, and elite politicians, all dressed in bespoke suits and carrying themselves with an air of absolute superiority. As I walked down the center aisle, the low hum of their wealthy conversations ground to a sudden jarring halt. Every single head turned to stare at the disheveled old carpenter marching through their pristine environment. A group of senior partners, men who billed their clients thousands of dollars an hour, stopped dead in their tracks near the elevators. I saw the absolute shock register in their eyes as they recognized the deeply weathered face beneath the damp flannel collar. They parted like the Red Sea, lowering their heads respectfully as I passed by. I did not acknowledge a single one of them. I stepped into the private executive elevator, inserted a specialized titanium keycard into the hidden slot, and pressed the button for the top floor. The doors closed, sealing away their stunned whispers. The elevator climbed smoothly, delivering me directly to the penthouse level. Before the doors even fully opened, I heard hurried footsteps echoing across the hardwood floor of the reception area. Jonathan burst out of his corner office, nearly knocking over his assistant in his absolute haste. Jonathan was a legal shark, a ruthless corporate attorney who billed $2,000 an hour and had successfully dismantled rival empires with a single stroke of his pen. He was a man who bowed to no one. But the moment he saw me step out of the elevator, he practically bowed at the waist, his usually sharp, predatory face softening into an expression of profound, terrified respect. "Mr. William." He breathed quickly, adjusting his expensive wire-rimmed glasses. "You have not stepped foot inside this building in a decade. What in the world is wrong?" I did not exchange pleasantries. I did not shake his extended hand. I walked straight past him, marching directly into his massive corner office that overlooked the glittering Seattle skyline. I took off my damp-stained canvas jacket and threw it aggressively onto the center of his pristine mahogany desk. Jonathan quickly closed the heavy oak door behind us, sealing the room off from the rest of the firm. He activated the electronic privacy locks, ensuring that no one could hear our conversation. I turned to face him, my expression completely devoid of warmth. "Jonathan," I said, my voice echoing with a low, dangerous gravel. "Break the seal on the blind trust. I want a supreme-level forensic audit executed on Apex Industries, and I want it initiated right this very second. Trace every single dime that Brad has touched since the day he took over as Chief Executive Officer. We are going to war." Jonathan stared at me, his eyes widening in absolute shock. Breaking the seal on the blind trust was the corporate equivalent of launching a nuclear strike. It would instantly strip away all of my carefully guarded anonymity, exposing my true identity to the financial markets, and giving me absolute dictatorial control over every single asset within the global logistics empire. It was a fail-safe protocol designed only for the most catastrophic emergencies. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" William, Jonathan asked, his voice trembling slightly as he moved quickly behind his desk. "If I bypass the proxy board and open these sealed ledgers, there is no going back. The entire financial sector will know exactly who you are by tomorrow morning." I placed both of my calloused hands flat against the polished surface of his mahogany desk. "I am completely certain," I replied, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate or hesitation. "He threatened my daughter. He mocked my late wife. He is actively stealing from my hard-working employees. Open the ledgers, Jonathan. Tear his entire world completely apart." Jonathan did not argue any further. He sat heavily in his leather executive chair and pulled his secure laptop forward. His fingers flew rapidly across the illuminated keyboard, executing incredibly complex decryption sequences. He was bypassing massive corporate firewalls and internal security grids that only the true owner of the conglomerate had the ultimate authority to access. I stood silently watching him, my jaw clenched tight as the encrypted banking data began pouring onto the large monitor mounted on the wall. The software began to automatically flag massive financial discrepancies in bright, glaring red. Jonathan leaned closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the rapid flow of illicit transactions. As he processed the raw, unfiltered data, the remaining color completely drained from his face. He stopped typing. His hands hovered over the keyboard, visibly shaking, as a look of sheer, unadulterated horror washed over him. He swallowed hard, unable to pull his eyes away from the glowing numbers. "William," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the silent room. I looked at the screen, tracing the jagged red lines depicting massive wealth leaving the corporate accounts. "He is not just stealing money from the pension funds," Jonathan stammered, turning his terrified gaze slowly toward me. "He is bleeding the entire company completely dry. He has been systematically draining everything. And William, please, you need to wait. Just look at this secondary file. This is much, much worse than we ever possibly imagined. There is a direct lethal threat targeting Sarah right now. We must act. We must act!" Jonathan continued, "But I cannot verify this threat right now. This secondary file is locked behind a massive military-grade encryption wall located on a private offshore server. If we force our way into this drive tonight, it will trigger an automatic deletion protocol. It will immediately alert him that we are watching. We need to dismantle his digital security piece by piece. I stared at the monitor, my jaw clenching. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to leave the office, drive straight to my daughter's house, and physically drag her away from that monster. How long will it take to break that firewall? I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. 3 days, Jonathan softly replied. Maybe 4 if his security architecture is as complex as I suspect it is. You need to disappear completely, William. You need to go into hiding and let him believe his plan is working perfectly. I am moving you to a secure private penthouse suite I own on the edge of the city. No one knows it belongs to me. You will stay there until we crack this server and expose exactly what he is planning to do to Sarah. I had no choice but to agree. A discreet security team soon escorted me up a private elevator into an immaculate penthouse overlooking the rain-swept skyline of Seattle. The apartment was a fortress of silent luxury filled with imported leather furniture, modern art, and vast empty spaces. But to me it felt absolutely nothing like a sanctuary. It felt like a sterile, high-altitude prison cell. The next 3 days were pure mind-numbing agony. I have navigated countless corporate crises and weathered massive financial storms throughout my life, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer psychological torture of this waiting period. I paced the expansive hardwood floors of the penthouse like a caged, starving wolf. I walked from the massive floor to ceiling windows to the marble kitchen island, back and forth, tracing the exact same path until my heavy work boots practically wore a groove into the polished wood. Every single hour felt like an entire grueling year. To maintain the elaborate illusion that I was safely out of the picture, I had to keep up my end of the deceptive charade. Jonathan had provided me with a specialized, untraceable burner phone that routed my signal through multiple southern servers. I spent my mornings sending pre-scheduled, carefully crafted text messages to Sarah so she would genuinely think I was walking along a sunny beach down in Florida. I sent her generic, cheerful updates about the warm weather, the gentle ocean breeze, and the quiet retirement community I was supposedly settling into. Typing those optimistic messages took every ounce of my willpower. Whenever my phone buzzed with a bright, loving reply from my daughter, my heart physically ached. She would text me about her day, completely oblivious to the dark, malicious web tightening around her. She would tell me that Brad was being remarkably kind, that he was taking her out to fancy dinners, and that he seemed much more relaxed now that his corporate stress had magically vanished. Hearing her praise the man plotting to destroy her made me sick to my stomach. I would stare at the glowing screen of the burner phone, my calloused thumb hovering nervously over the call button. I desperately wanted to call her, to scream into the receiver, to tell her to pack her bags and run as fast as she possibly could. But I knew that if I broke my silence, the entire trap would fall apart. I had to swallow my fear and let the silence fester. On the second afternoon of my confinement, the burner phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table, shattering the oppressive silence of the penthouse. It was a photo message from Sarah. My breath hitched as I opened the image. It was a selfie of her and Brad standing in their sprawling, ultra-modern kitchen. Sarah was wearing a beautiful floral dress, offering the camera a soft, genuinely hopeful smile. Brad stood behind her, his arms wrapped possessively around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He was smiling too, playing the role of the devoted, loving husband with sickening perfection. The caption beneath the photo read, "Having a quiet lunch together before the big gala prep begins. Brad is being so sweet today, Dad. He even brought me my favorite coffee this morning. I think things are really turning around. I hope you are enjoying the sunshine down in Florida. Miss you so much." Staring at that glowing screen, a profound, suffocating nausea washed over me. I zoomed in on Brad's face, staring into the dark, dead eyes of a man who was actively plotting the murder of the woman he was holding. He was putting on a flawless performance, lulling my innocent daughter into a false sense of absolute security so she would not suspect a single thing when he suggested she drive home alone on that treacherous mountain pass. He was buttering her up, ensuring she would be isolated, trusting and entirely vulnerable. My fingers hovered over the keypad. I typed out a frantic, desperate warning. "Sarah, get out of the house right now. Call a cab. Go to a hotel under a false name. He is going to kill you." My thumb hovered over the send button, trembling violently. The urge to blow the operation and save her immediately was almost impossible to resist. But Jonathan's warnings echoed loudly in my mind. If I tipped Brad off, he would vanish. He had millions in offshore accounts and private jets at his disposal. He would disappear into the international wind, and Sarah would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, hunted by a ghost. I gritted my teeth, slowly deleting the desperate warning character by agonizing character. Instead, I forced my calloused thumbs to type a sickeningly cheerful lie. "The sunshine is beautiful here, sweetheart. I am so glad to hear you guys are doing well. Have a wonderful time at the gala. Love you always." Hitting send on that message felt like driving a rusty nail directly into my own heart. I tossed the burner phone onto the plush leather sofa and walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the unforgiving Seattle rain, praying to Mary that I was making the right decision. As the long, agonizing hours bled into restless, sleepless nights, my mind became a relentless battleground of regret and deep self-reflection. I stood by the window and reviewed the quiet life I had built for Sarah. When my beautiful wife Mary was still alive, we had made a conscious, deliberate choice to raise our only child far away from the toxic, cutthroat realities of immense corporate wealth. We wanted her to value honest work, genuine kindness, and simple joys. We wanted her to be a good, compassionate person, untainted by the blinding greed that naturally follows a billion-dollar logistics empire. We succeeded in shielding her from the darkness, but as I paced the empty penthouse, I realized the catastrophic flaw in our parenting. By keeping her safely locked inside a warm, protective bubble of simplicity, I had inadvertently kept her blind to the true predatory nature of the real world. I had not taught her how to recognize a corporate shark, because I never wanted her to swim in those dangerous waters. Ironically, my desire to protect her had made her the perfect target for a manipulator like Brad. He had easily identified her inherent kindness and weaponized it against her, using her pure, trusting nature to secure his position and steal my legacy. The heavy, crushing guilt of that terrible realization weighed on my shoulders like a ton of solid lead. I had built a massive financial fortress to secure her future, but I had failed to give her the armor she needed to survive the people trying to conquer it. By the fourth night, the silence in the penthouse had become completely unbearable. I had not slept for more than a few fragmented minutes since I arrived. I sat alone in a dark leather armchair in the quiet corner of the expansive living room, staring blankly at the distant city skyline, waiting for a breakthrough that felt like it would never come. The digital clock on the sleek glass coffee table glowed with a harsh, unforgiving red light. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing ring of my specialized burner phone shattered the dead silence of the room. I lunged forward and snatched the device from the table, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. I pressed the phone tightly to my ear. William Jonathan said, his voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant, confident swagger. He was breathing heavily, his words trembling with a raw, undisguised terror that chilled me. I have known this ruthless corporate attorney for a decade, and I have never once heard him sound truly afraid. "I am here, Jonathan," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. "Tell me you finally broke through the encryption wall." "We did," Jonathan stammered, the sound of frantic keyboard typing echoing in the background over the secure line. "We finally cracked his private offshore server just a few tense minutes ago. William, you need to come to the office right now. I am sending the security team to extract you immediately." "What did you find?" I demanded, gripping the phone so tightly the cheap plastic casing groaned under the intense pressure of my calloused hands. William, Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice shaking with absolute dread. It is not just the massive corporate embezzlement anymore. We found his private communications and the hidden offshore contracts. It involves Sarah. It involves her life. The sheer weight of those agonizing words hung in the dead silence of the penthouse. I did not ask him any further questions at all. I hung up the secure burner phone, grabbed my faded canvas jacket, and sprinted toward the private elevator. My heavy work boots slammed against the polished hardwood floor, echoing with a frantic rhythm. The discreet security team was already waiting for me in the underground parking garage, the engine of their armored vehicle idling with a low, powerful hum. I threw myself into the back seat. The driver immediately floored the accelerator, sending us tearing through the dark, rain-slicked streets of downtown Seattle. The city was a blur of neon lights and heavy shadows, but my mind was completely consumed by a blinding, terrifying panic. I had spent my entire life building an impenetrable fortress of wealth to protect my only child. Now I was rushing into the dark heart of a corporate conspiracy that threatened to take her away from me forever. The vehicle screeched to a halt in front of the towering law firm. I did not wait for the team to open my door. I shoved it open myself and marched aggressively through the grand marble lobby. The private executive elevator whisked me up to the penthouse level in a matter of seconds, but it felt like an agonizing eternity. The doors slid apart, and I stormed directly down the silent, carpeted corridor toward Jonathan's expansive corner office. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with enough force to rattle the glass partitions. Jonathan was standing at the far end of the room, leaning heavily over a massive, polished granite conference table. The entire surface of the table was completely covered in a chaotic sea of bright red financial folders, printed bank ledgers, and heavily encrypted corporate emails that had been forcibly extracted from the offshore server. Jonathan looked up as I entered the room. He had taken off his expensive wire-rimmed glasses. His usually sharp, predatory eyes were bloodshot and filled with an exhaustion I had never seen before. He looked like a man who had just gazed directly into the absolute abyss of human greed. He gestured weakly toward the sea of red folders spread out across the table. I walked over, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. The overhead lighting cast harsh, unforgiving shadows over the staggering amount of printed evidence. I placed my hands flat against the cold edge of the granite table and looked down at the top document. It was a complex wire transfer receipt routing millions of dollars through a convoluted maze of international banking institutions. He has not just stolen $5 million from the employee pension fund, Jonathan said, his voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. That was just the surface layer, William. It was a minor, careless distraction meant to keep the internal auditors busy while he executed the real theft behind closed doors. I followed the digital paper trail deep into the Cayman Islands. Brad and his parents have been working together for the past 2 years to systematically dismantle everything you built. I picked up one of those red folders, my calloused fingers trembling slightly as I flipped through the dense pages of financial records. The documents painted a horrifying picture of calculated, ruthless corporate treason. Brad had not acted alone. Richard and Patricia, the very same arrogant snobs who had mocked my faded clothes and working-class roots at the French restaurant, were listed as the primary beneficiaries and shadow directors of 5 highly sophisticated shell companies. They had used their prestigious social standing and pristine public reputations to establish these fraudulent entities completely under the radar. They had created fake vendor contracts, billed Apex Industries for massive non-existent logistical services, and funneled the payments directly into their offshore accounts. Every single time Patricia had bought a designer purse, or Richard had ordered a $500 bottle of wine, they had paid for it using the stolen blood and sweat of my dedicated warehouse workers. They have successfully siphoned exactly $45 million out of the operational capital over the last 24 months. Jonathan continued, pointing a shaking finger at a highlighted column of devastating numbers. They drained the liquid assets so aggressively that Apex Industries is currently running on fumes. The company is practically insolvent, William. If the global markets were to open tomorrow, and the real financial standing of the conglomerate was exposed to the public, the stock would completely crash. You would be facing immediate bankruptcy, and thousands of your loyal employees would lose their jobs, their pensions, and their entire livelihoods overnight. The sheer scale of the theft was absolutely staggering. $45 million. It was a level of greed that defied all logic and human decency. But as I stared at the devastating financial ledgers, another even more sinister document caught my eye. It was an executive contract drafted in extreme secrecy and stamped with the highly confidential logo of our biggest international corporate rival. I picked up the contract, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted paragraphs of legal jargon. Brad had already signed the bottom of the page, acting as the authorized chief executive officer of Apex. He is not stopping at the embezzlement, Jonathan explained, stepping around the table to stand beside me. The upcoming CEO gala next week is not a simple corporate celebration or a networking event. It is a smokescreen. Brad has secretly finalized a backdoor deal to sell the proprietary software patents and the exclusive international shipping routes of Apex Industries to our largest competitor. He is going to sign the final transfer documents in the VIP lounge during the gala, while the press and the politicians are busy drinking champagne in the main ballroom. Once those patents are legally transferred, Apex will be reduced to an empty, worthless shell. He will wire the final payout to Zurich, step down as CEO, and walk away with a golden parachute, while the entire empire burns to the ground. I gritted my teeth, feeling a cold, predatory calm slowly replace the initial shock. The money was a catastrophic loss, an incredible blow to the foundation of the company. But I am a builder. I am a man who knows exactly how to take raw, broken materials and forge them into something stronger. I could rebuild the operational capital. I could replace $45 million. I could fire the corrupt executives, restructure the entire board of directors, and save the company from the brink of absolute insolvency. Money, no matter how vast the sum was, ultimately just numbers on a digital screen. It could always be recovered by a man who was willing to get his hands dirty. But Jonathan had not called me at 2 a.m, trembling with absolute terror, just to tell me about stolen patents and empty bank accounts. I turned my head, slowly locking my gaze onto his pale face. "You said this involved Sarah," I growled. Jonathan hesitated for a very long, painful moment, then slowly pushed a black folder across the table. I stared at the black folder resting on the cold granite surface of the conference table. The heavy silence in the room felt suffocating, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. Jonathan did not say another word. He simply withdrew his hand, leaving the terrible truth sitting right in front of me. My calloused fingers trembled slightly as I reached out and flipped open the thick, dark cover. The very first document staring back at me was a comprehensive life insurance policy. It was issued by one of the most exclusive financial institutions in the world. I scanned the bold clinical text at the top of the page. The coverage amount was staggering. $20 million. My eyes moved rapidly down the complex legal paragraphs until they landed on the designated beneficiary section. Brad had proudly listed himself as the absolute sole recipient of this massive, entirely unwarranted fortune. At the very bottom of the final page, written in familiar blue ink, was the signature of my daughter. But I had watched Sarah write her name thousands of times over the past 3 decades. I knew every single curve and loop of her handwriting. A specialized forensic overlay provided by the elite investigation team confirmed my immediate sickening suspicion. The signature was a meticulous, highly calculated forgery. I turned the page, my breathing growing shallow and increasingly erratic. Beneath the fraudulent insurance policy was a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs captured by a private investigator. They showed Brad dining at upscale, secluded restaurants, walking through dimly lit parking garages, and entering luxury hotel suites. He was not alone in any of these images. The stunning woman clinging to his arm, leaning in to whisper intimately in his ear, was none other than Rachel, the Apex marketing VP. She was a woman I had personally approved for a massive promotion just 4 years ago. Brad was not just a corporate thief destroying my entire legacy. He was a serial manipulator, a ruthless man leading a complete double life while sleeping next to my innocent daughter. Next to the damning photographs lay a printed itinerary from a private Swiss airline. There were 2 first-class one-way tickets booked directly to Zurich. The departure time was scheduled for 6 sharp in the morning, the exact morning right after the highly anticipated corporate gala. They were not just planning to flee with the embezzled pension funds. They were patiently waiting for a massive payout to fund their new life together. I looked up at Jonathan, feeling the blood in my veins turning to absolute ice. How does he plan to collect on this enormous life insurance policy payout right now? I asked, my voice cracking under the immense weight of the horrifying realization. Jonathan swallowed hard, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He turned away from the table and slowly reached for his encrypted laptop. "There is one final piece of evidence, William," he whispered, his fingers flying across the illuminated keyboard. We managed to install a deep system keylogger onto his private secured laptop. It secretly captured every single keystroke, every deleted file, and every internet search history he made over the course of the last month. I am bringing it up on the main screen right now. You need to prepare yourself for this. The large digital monitor mounted on the far wall of the office flickered to life. A stark white document filled the screen, displaying a long chronological list of internet search queries. I stood up from my comfortable leather desk chair instantly. My heavy work boots felt like solid lead as I took a slow step closer to the glowing monitor. I narrowed my eyes, forcing myself to read the horrifying, deeply calculated questions that my son-in-law had typed into the dark corners of the internet. I read the search queries aloud, my voice breaking and trembling with every single syllable. How to make automotive brake lines fail naturally. Undetectable physical tampering of modern steering columns. Best isolated mountain roads for fatal, accidental car crashes. The horrific words hung in the sterile air of the law firm. Toxic and completely devastating. A blinding, ringing silence instantly filled my ears, drowning out the ambient hum of the city traffic down below. The complex, sinister puzzle finally clicked together in my mind, revealing a picture so unimaginably evil that it completely defied all basic human decency and absolutely destroyed my very soul. The $20,000 bribe at the French restaurant. The aggressive, condescending demands to get me completely out of the state of Washington. The sudden, fake concern for my aging lungs. He had not forced me onto a train to Florida because he was embarrassed by my faded flannel shirt or my scuffed work boots. He had systematically removed me from the equation so that Sarah would be completely, utterly isolated. I was her only remaining family, her only line of defense, and he had paid me to abandon her. His dark, twisted plan was meticulously engineered. On the night of the corporate gala, while he was busy drinking expensive champagne and smiling for the financial press, Sarah would eventually leave the event early, just as she always did when she felt overwhelmed by large social crowds. She would walk to the valet, get into her luxury car, and drive. The route to their secluded house required navigating a treacherous, winding mountain pass that was notorious for its steep, unforgiving drops and incredibly poor evening visibility. He planned to cut her brake lines. He planned to sabotage her steering column. He intended to let my beautiful, innocent daughter drive her vehicle straight off a dark mountain cliff, completely alone and terrified in her final moments. He would play the role of the grieving, heartbroken widower for the cameras, collect the $20 million fraudulent insurance policy, and board a first-class flight to Switzerland with his mistress the very next morning. I stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the glowing monitor, until the horrific words burned themselves permanently into my retinas. For the past 4 days, I had paced the floors of that empty penthouse, drowning in profound guilt, wondering where I had utterly failed her. I constantly questioned where I had gone wrong in protecting my child from the vicious corporate world. I mourned the massive loss of my operational capital. I felt the sharp sting of profound betrayal. But in this exact moment, every single trace of sorrow, every ounce of hesitation, and every lingering shred of peaceful retirement completely evaporated from my soul. I am a 78-year-old man. I have lived a long, quiet life, content to build things with my bare hands and fade away into the comforting shadows of anonymity. I have buried the love of my life, and I willingly surrendered my immense power to ensure my daughter could live in peace. But as I stood there realizing that a greedy, arrogant parasite had actively plotted to murder my only child for a payout, the deep, heavy grief entirely burned away, leaving only pure, unadulterated predatory wrath. I did not scream out loud. I did not flip the heavy granite conference table or throw the black folder aggressively against the far wall of the room. When a man is faced with a betrayal of this magnitude, loud anger is nothing but a completely useless, wasteful expenditure of valuable energy. I simply closed the folder, pressing my calloused hand flat against its dark cover, and stood up straight from the soft leather chair. The immense, crushing grief that had paralyzed me just moments ago completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and lethal stillness. I looked across the table at Jonathan. The ruthless corporate attorney, a man who had orchestrated hostile takeovers and dismantled international conglomerates without breaking a sweat, actually took a half-step backward. He saw the shift in my posture. He saw the dead, unblinking emptiness in my eyes. I was no longer the heartbroken, retired father mourning the loss of a quiet life. I had reverted entirely to the apex predator who had built a multi-billion-dollar global empire from a single rusty pickup truck. I kept my voice incredibly low, maintaining a perfectly even, chilling tone that left absolutely no room for negotiation. Jonathan said, staring into his pale face, "I want you to freeze every offshore account tied to Brad, his father Richard, and his mother Patricia. Do not red flag the transactions. I want you to initiate a total catastrophic asset freeze across all international banking platforms. Use the supreme executive override built into the blind trust. Lock those Cayman Island accounts down so tightly that by tomorrow morning they cannot even buy a cup of black coffee without their credit cards being declined. I want their entire stolen financial kingdom reduced to ashes before the sun comes up. They thought they could use my own operational capital to fund their luxurious escape to Switzerland. I am going to make sure they do not have a single dime left to their names." Jonathan nodded, his fingers already flying across the illuminated keys of his encrypted laptop, unleashing a digital onslaught that would instantly sever Brad from his stolen millions. But cutting off his money was only the first preliminary phase of my retaliation. He had actively plotted to murder my only child, and for that financial ruin was nowhere near an adequate punishment. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles against the cold stone of the conference table. "Next, I want you to contact your liaisons within the federal government. Have the Federal Bureau of Investigation Fraud and Embezzlement Division is placed on immediate standby. I want a fleet of federal agents waiting silently in the shadows, just outside the perimeter of the Four Seasons Hotel, during the corporate gala tomorrow night. They are not to make a single move until I personally give the absolute final signal. Brad is going to stand on that brightly lit stage wearing his custom-tailored tuxedo, and he is going to smile for the financial press. I want him to feel the rush of total victory right before I strip everything away from him in front of the entire city." Within 2 hours of our terrifying discovery, Jonathan's expansive corner office had been completely transformed into a highly classified federal command center. The polished granite conference table, previously covered in red financial ledgers, was now dominated by a sprawling, high-resolution digital blueprint of the Four Seasons Hotel. A team of 12 senior FBI agents specifically handpicked from the elite white-collar crime and domestic terrorism task forces stood around the perimeter of the room. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man named Vance with sharp, unforgiving eyes, briefed the room with military precision. "We have the wire transfer protocols locked down," Agent Vance stated, pointing to the digital map. The moment Chairman William gives the final signal, my cyber division will execute the ultimate block on the Zurich accounts. We have also secured the hotel's entire surveillance grid. We have eyes on the main ballroom, the VIP lounges, the underground parking garage, and all service exits. Nobody breathes in that building tonight without us knowing about it. I leaned against the heavy oak door, my arms crossed over my faded flannel shirt, absorbing every single tactical detail. "And my daughter?" I asked, my voice low and heavily graveled. "What is the exact protocol for Sarah?" Vance nodded respectfully in my direction. "We are not taking any chances with her, sir. We have replaced the hotel's standard valet staff with our own undercover operatives. The moment her luxury sedan arrives on the premises, it will be quietly diverted into a secure subterranean lockdown bay guarded by 4 armed agents. We have already swept the vehicle for tracking devices and physical tampering. She is entirely insulated. Brad's hired mechanic will not even be able to get within a 3-block radius of that car without ending up in federal handcuffs." The meticulous level of preparation provided a small measure of comfort, but the burning knot of anxiety in my stomach refused to untighten. We were setting a massive, highly explosive trap in a room filled with hundreds of innocent bystanders, politicians, and the city's elite. If Brad realized he was cornered before I took the stage, the situation could spiral into unpredictable chaos. I walked over to the table and looked directly at Agent Vance. "Brad is arrogant, but he is not stupid," I warned them. "He is a cornered rat who believes he is about to become a lion. When the walls close in, he might panic. I want your men completely invisible until the exact moment I take the microphone." Jonathan swallowed hard. His eyes locked onto his screen as he executed the commands. "It is being done right now, William," he replied, his voice still trembling slightly. He asked what we would do about Sarah. I straightened my posture, my jaw setting into rigid stone at the mention of my beautiful, unsuspecting daughter. "I am not taking a chance with her safety," I instructed firmly. "Dispatch your most elite specialized security team immediately. I want them deployed to the downtown valet parking garage where Sarah keeps her vehicle during these corporate events. They are to establish a secure, invisible perimeter around her luxury sedan. If Brad or any of his hired mechanics attempt to step within 50 feet of her steering column or her brake lines, your men are to intercept them with extreme prejudice. She is not to drive that car tomorrow night under any circumstances. Arrange a discreet, armored transport vehicle to quietly swap places with her usual driver. I will ensure she gets home myself." He tried to engineer a mountain crash to claim a fraudulent $20 million life insurance policy. I am going to make absolutely certain that the only thing crashing tomorrow night is his entire pathetic existence. With the tactical orders firmly in place, I turned away from the sprawling conference table and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the dark, rain-swept streets of downtown Seattle. The city was a sprawling ocean of glittering neon lights and deep, impenetrable shadows. I stared at my own reflection, superimposed over the glowing urban landscape. I looked at the faded, worn fabric of my red flannel shirt. I looked at the frayed edges of my denim collar and the deep, permanent creases etched into my weathered face. I raised my hands and pressed my rough, scarred palms against the cold glass. Brad had looked at this exact same reflection in that expensive French restaurant and seen nothing but a weak, disposable peasant. He saw a man who had been defeated by the passage of time, a man who could easily be bought off with a thick envelope of untraceable cash. He had completely underestimated the quiet, unassuming nature of my retirement. He looked at my simple life and sincerely thought he was dealing with a helpless, mindless sheep wandering blindly into a slaughterhouse. He failed to understand that a man does not build a multi-billion-dollar global empire by being soft. You do not conquer the cutthroat, vicious world of international logistics by asking politely. I had spent decades swimming with absolute monsters, breaking rival corporations, and burying hostile competitors who thought they were smarter than me. I had simply chosen to hang up my armor and live in peace because my late wife asked me to. Brad had violently ripped me out of that peaceful retirement. He had forced the old wolf to come out of the dark woods. I looked at my calloused hands one last time, remembering the absolute arrogance in his eyes when he told me I was a dirty stain on his family portrait. He wanted to play a deadly game of corporate chess with my family, completely unaware that I actually owned the entire board. I slowly turned away from the rain-slicked window and faced the center of the room. The air felt charged heavy with the unavoidable promise of absolute, uncompromising retribution. I reached down and methodically buttoned up the front of my old faded canvas jacket, adjusting the worn collar around my neck. I looked directly at Jonathan, who was watching me with a mixture of profound awe and deep, respectful fear. They wanted a grand, historic celebration for the prestigious Chief Executive Officer. I said, my voice cutting through the quiet office like a sharpened blade. Let us give them a truly spectacular, unforgettable finale they will remember in excruciating detail for the rest of their miserable lives. We will hunt tonight. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel was a breathtaking display of absolute uncompromising luxury. Thousands of delicate glass crystals hung from the massive chandeliers suspended across the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the immaculate room. Towering pyramids of expensive champagne glasses caught the light, sparkling brightly, as white-gloved waiters moved silently through the crowd, pouring vintage wine for the city elite. The room was packed with the most powerful and affluent figures in the financial world. Local politicians, influential board members, and ruthless corporate journalists were all gathered together to celebrate the prestigious anniversary of Apex Industries. The air was thick with the scent of roasted truffles, expensive floral perfumes, and the intoxicating aroma of unlimited wealth. But as I watched the live security feed from a dark, unmarked command van parked just 2 blocks away, all I could see was a room entirely funded by the stolen blood, sweat, and tears of my hardworking employees. Every single drop of champagne poured tonight was paid for by the drained pension funds of the men and women who had trusted me with their futures. Standing at the very center of the elevated, brightly lit stage was my son-in-law, Brad. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was slicked back, and his handsome, arrogant face beamed with the radiant confidence of a man who believed he had successfully conquered the entire modern corporate world. He held a silver microphone in his hand, projecting a deep, charismatic voice that echoed smoothly across the sprawling ballroom. He was delivering a carefully rehearsed, sickeningly self-righteous speech about the fundamental importance of family values, profound corporate integrity, and the unbreakable loyalty that defined the Apex brand. The absolute hypocrisy of his words was staggering. He stood up there looking out over the sea of wealthy investors and spoke eloquently about the sacred trust between an executive and his employees. He smiled warmly for the flashing cameras of the financial press, painting himself as a visionary leader and a dedicated family man. He played the part so perfectly that anyone in that room would have gladly handed him their life savings. They had absolutely no idea that the man standing behind the podium was a ruthless, cold-blooded parasite actively plotting a brutal murder. Sitting in the very front row, basking in the radiant glow of their son and his stolen glory, were Richard and Patricia. They occupied the most exclusive and highly coveted VIP table in the entire ballroom, surrounded by influential politicians and wealthy socialites. Patricia wore a stunning diamond-encrusted evening gown that glittered aggressively every time she moved. She held her delicate crystal flute in the air, clinking glasses with the local governor, laughing softly at a joke she probably did not even understand. Richard sat beside her, puffing his chest out with immense, suffocating pride. He adjusted the expensive silk tie resting against his tailored collar, his eyes shining with pure, unfiltered greed. They were thoroughly enjoying the luxurious fruits of their highly sophisticated offshore shell companies. They believed their criminal enterprise was completely flawless and entirely untraceable. Just a few tables away from them sat Rachel, the vice president of marketing. She wore a sleek, incredibly revealing red dress that drew the eyes of every man in her immediate vicinity. She sat quietly, swirling her dark wine, but her eyes never once left Brad. Every few minutes, they would exchange a secret, hungry look across the crowded room. It was a silent, thrilling confirmation of their impending escape. They were both mentally counting down the hours until they could board that private, first-class flight to Zurich and disappear with my millions. While the predators celebrated their dark, impending victory, my beautiful daughter sat completely alone in the cold, distant shadows of the grand ballroom. Sarah occupied a small, secluded table near the heavy velvet curtains, far away from the flashing cameras and the suffocating crowds. She looked profoundly exhausted. The vibrant, fiercely independent energy she used to carry had been entirely drained away by years of relentless psychological manipulation. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her eyes fixed blankly on the table. She looked incredibly isolated, completely unaware that she was surrounded by a den of ruthless, calculating wolves. She believed her husband was up on that stage working tirelessly to secure their future. She believed his parents were just difficult, demanding people who simply wanted the best for their son. She had absolutely no idea that the man she loved had spent the last month researching how to sabotage her steering column. She did not know that he had forged her signature on a $20 million life insurance policy, or that he was waiting for her to drive home alone on that treacherous, winding mountain pass later tonight. The profound vulnerability in her posture broke my heart, fueling the cold, predatory wrath burning deep inside my soul. Up on the stage, Brad slowly transitioned his charismatic speech toward the final, devastating phase of his grand plan. He spoke about the ever-changing landscape of global logistics, the need for aggressive modernization, and the importance of bold, unprecedented strategic partnerships. He smoothly signaled to a wealthy, gray-haired man sitting at a reserved table near the front. It was the chief executive officer of our largest international rival. The man stood up, buttoning his tailored jacket, and began walking toward the stage with a deeply satisfied, victorious smile. Brad motioned for his executive assistant, who immediately stepped forward carrying a sleek, leather-bound portfolio. Inside that portfolio were the finalized, highly confidential merger documents, the documents that would legally sign away all of our proprietary software patents and exclusive international shipping routes, reducing my life work to an empty, worthless shell. Brad reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. He held it up for the flashing cameras basking in the thunderous applause of the completely oblivious crowd. He turned around, walking slowly toward the polished wooden podium where the open documents waited. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the podium, and placed the sharp golden tip of the pen directly onto the thick white paper. He was one single signature away from total, irreversible victory. And then the massive, heavy oak doors at the very back of the grand ballroom violently swung open completely, shattering the anticipation with a sudden, deafening and terrifying crash. The massive, heavy oak doors at the very back of the grand ballroom violently swung open with a sudden, deafening crash that completely shattered the anticipation in the room. The loud, jarring noise echoed across the vast vaulted ceiling, instantly silencing the soft classical music and the polite murmurs of the wealthy elite. Every single head in the sprawling room turned simultaneously toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold and walked slowly down the long center aisle. I was not wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo or polished leather dress shoes. I wore the exact same faded red flannel shirt and the same scuffed, dirt-stained work boots I had worn to that arrogant dinner just a few days ago. The stark contrast between my weathered blue-collar appearance and the breathtaking, sparkling luxury of the ballroom was incredibly striking. The heavy, rhythmic thud of my boots against the pristine white marble floor sounded like the steady, unavoidable ticking of a deadly countdown clock. The crowded sea of wealthy politicians, corporate investors, and high society socialites instinctively parted ways to let me through. They pulled their expensive silk gowns and tailored suit jackets away from me, whispering to one another in absolute shock and deep confusion. They looked at me as if a rabid, dangerous animal had somehow wandered out of the dark woods and stepped right into their immaculate, highly exclusive sanctuary. The atmosphere in the room felt as heavy as thick, damp smoke. The air conditioning hummed quietly above, but I could feel the intense heat radiating from the panicked bodies pressing away from me. The glittering champagne towers seemed to lose their bright luster under the oppressive tension that had just flooded into the vast space. Every breath taken by the high society crowd was shallow and filled with a sudden creeping dread. They were witnessing something they could not possibly comprehend. A poor working-class man had just invaded their flawless sanctuary, and he was walking with the slow, deliberate confidence of an absolute conqueror. Patricia was the very first person to react to my presence. She leaped up from her comfortable chair at the front table, her face contorted into a dark mask of pure, unadulterated horror and absolute fury. Her expensive diamond necklace flashed aggressively under the bright crystal chandeliers as she began to scream at the very top of her lungs. "Security!" she shrieked, her shrill voice slicing right through the tense, heavy silence of the massive ballroom. "Where is the security team right now? Who let this disgusting vagrant back into this prestigious building? Grab this man and throw him out into the freezing street immediately." Up on the brilliantly lit stage, the color completely drained from Brad, and his handsome face only to be instantly replaced by a deep, flushed and burning embarrassment. The solid gold fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the polished wooden podium with a sharp clatter and rolled right onto the floor, completely forgotten. He abandoned the precious forged merger documents and marched aggressively down the short flight of carpeted stairs toward the main floor. He stormed down the center aisle to intercept me, his eyes incredibly wide with a frantic, desperate rage. He stopped right in front of me, physically blocking my path, and leaned in very close so the surrounding crowd could not hear his highly toxic words. "Are you completely insane, old man?" he hissed, his breath hot and ragged with sudden rising panic. "I paid you $20,000 to permanently disappear. You are entirely ruining the most important night of my entire professional career. Get out of here right now before I have the local police arrest you for criminal trespassing and corporate sabotage." I did not stop walking. I did not slow my steady pace, and I did not even turn my head to acknowledge his pathetic, desperate existence. I simply kept my eyes locked on the very front of the grand room, and kept moving forward physically, forcing my highly arrogant son-in-law to stumble awkwardly out of my way to avoid a direct physical collision. He spun around, opening his mouth to shout another angry threat, but the angry words completely died in his throat. Right behind me, stepping smoothly through the shattered threshold of the grand oak doors, was Jonathan. The ruthless corporate attorney marched into the grand ballroom with a dark, terrifying, predatory confidence. But he did not come into the room alone. He was tightly flanked by a dozen heavily armed private security contractors dressed in immaculate tactical black suits. They moved with a terrifying, highly synchronized military precision. Patricia clutched her small designer purse tightly against her chest, her knuckles turning completely white. She looked around desperately, expecting the other wealthy guests to join her in demanding my immediate removal. But the guests were too paralyzed by the sudden arrival of the heavily armed private military contractors. They stood completely still in absolute fear. Without saying a single word, the elite security team rapidly fanned out across the massive ballroom. They moved with absolute authority, immediately taking up strategic positions and physically blocking every single exit and entrance in the entire building. The hushed whispers of the wealthy crowd suddenly transformed into a low, frantic murmur of genuine panic. The elite guests suddenly realized that this was not a simple security breach or a random minor disruption. They were entirely locked inside the room, and absolutely no one was allowed to leave the premises. I continued my slow, steady march straight down the long center aisle, leaving Brad standing completely frozen in the middle of the room, looking incredibly confused and suddenly very small. I completely ignored the terrified gasps of the local politicians and the nervous shifting of the rival corporate executives. I walked purposefully past the lavishly decorated dining tables until I reached the reserved, highly exclusive seating section at the very front of the grand ballroom. This was the exact table where the true power of Apex Industries resided. It was currently occupied by the elite, untouchable billionaires who made up the elusive board of directors, the powerful men and women who controlled vast international markets and dictated the financial futures of countless thousands of hardworking employees. These were the exact same titans of industry that Brad had been desperately trying to impress and actively manipulate all night long. As I stepped up to the edge of their pristine table, they did not call for the armed guards to intervene. They did not recoil in arrogant disgust at my worn flannel shirt or my heavily scuffed work boots. Instead, an absolute profound silence fell over the entire front row. In perfect, highly rehearsed unison, the most powerful and affluent billionaires in the room stood up from their plush velvet chairs. They straightened their posture, looked directly at my weathered face, and bowed their heads deeply and respectfully. "Good evening, Chairman William," they said together, their voices echoing with absolute unwavering loyalty across the stunned and completely paralyzed ballroom. The sharp, piercing sound of delicate crystal shattering against the polished marble floor broke the profound silence of the grand ballroom. Patricia had dropped her extremely expensive champagne flute. The bubbling liquid pooled around her designer heels, but she did not even blink a single time. She stood completely paralyzed, her jaw hanging slack as she stared at the elite billionaires of the board of directors, who were all still bowing deeply in my direction. The warm blood rapidly drained from Brad's handsome, incredibly arrogant face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost trapped under the harsh glare of the stage spotlights. He stumbled backward, his highly polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the carpeted stairs. He gripped the edge of the wooden podium tightly to keep himself from collapsing entirely. His chest heaved with sudden ragged breaths as his desperate eyes darted between the bowing executives, the heavily armed security contractors blocking the exits, and the faded, worn flannel shirt resting heavily on my shoulders. He slowly opened his mouth to speak, but his voice came out as a terribly weak, trembling whisper. "Chairman," he stammered, shaking his head in absolute panicked, desperate denial. "You are just a simple carpenter. You do not own anything at all." I did not say a single word to him from the floor. I walked up the short, carpeted steps, my heavy work boots thudding with a steady, powerful, and commanding rhythm. I stepped directly onto the brilliantly lit stage, completely invading his carefully constructed spotlight. I reached out and calmly took the silver microphone right out of his trembling fingers. He did not resist my grip. He was entirely consumed by absolute paralyzing shock. I turned to firmly face the sprawling, stunned crowd of politicians, investors, and high society socialites. My voice echoed smoothly across the massive ballroom, entirely devoid of the weak, intimidated tone I had used just a few days ago in the basement loading dock. "I built this global empire from the ground up with my own bare hands," I announced clearly, letting the heavy truth sink into the silent room. I poured the very first concrete foundation, and I quietly watched from the shadows as this company grew. I looked slowly down at Brad, who was now visibly shaking like a coward beside the wooden podium. "And tonight, Brad, I am finally taking out all the trash." I raised my hand, giving Jonathan the final decisive signal. The ruthless corporate attorney tapped a single key on his secure tablet. Instantly, the massive high-definition presentation screens hanging behind the stage blinked to life. Instead of the polished corporate logos and the deceptive merger documents Brad had prepared, the screens displayed a highly classified deep-dive forensic financial audit. The crowd gasped loudly in perfect unison as bright red ledgers flooded the massive monitors. I narrated the devastating evidence for the entire room to hear. Over the last 24 months, our esteemed chief executive officer, along with his parents Richard and Patricia, set up a fraudulent network of 5 shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They systematically embezzled $45 million from our operational capital and our blue-collar employee pension funds. A loud, angry murmur ripped through the crowd of investors. "But do not worry," I continued, my voice slicing through the rising panic. "As the sole owner of the blind trust, I authorized a supreme executive override this morning." The screens instantly shifted to display the offshore banking accounts. The previous balance of $45 million flashed on the screen before rapidly dropping to a stark, bold 0. The money has been fully recovered and safely returned to the pensions. Your stolen, pathetic financial kingdom is completely gone forever, Brad. The screens shifted again this time, displaying two incredibly expensive first-class one-way flight confirmations to Zurich scheduled for tomorrow morning, along with high-resolution photographs of Brad kissing Rachel, the vice president of marketing, in a secluded hotel lobby. Rachel leaped up aggressively from her table in the back of the room, covering her pale face with her shaking hands as the crowd turned to glare at her in utter complete disgust. Brad let out a pathetic, desperately choked sob, heavily falling to his knees directly on the stage. But the embezzlement and the cowardly escape plan were not the worst of his crimes. I said, my voice dropping to a dark, lethal register that made the entire ballroom hold its breath. The screens flickered one final time. A $20 million life insurance policy appeared, naming Brad as the sole beneficiary, accompanied by a forensic report, proving my daughter's signature was entirely forged. Beside the fraudulent policy, a dark chronological list of internet search queries populated the screen. I read the horrifying words aloud for the entire city elite to hear. How to make automotive brake lines fail naturally. Undetectable physical tampering of modern steering columns. Best isolated mountain roads for fatal car crashes. The collective gasp of absolute unadulterated horror from the crowd was deafening. Women covered their mouths in shock, and several board members looked physically sick. He wanted my daughter to drive home alone tonight, on a treacherous mountain pass, so he could cut her brakes, collect the $20 million and fly to Switzerland with his mistress, I declared, my voice trembling with raw, unrestrained fury. The heavy, blinding silence that followed my devastating revelation was instantly shattered by the sharp metallic clinking of heavy handcuffs. Over a dozen Federal Bureau of Investigation agents who had been waiting silently in the dark shadows of the ballroom suddenly stepped forward into the bright light. Down in the front row, Richard and Patricia frantically pushed their chairs back, desperately trying to sneak toward the side exit. Two large federal agents intercepted them immediately, slamming the arrogant, wealthy couple forcefully against the velvet-covered wall. Patricia shrieked in absolute terror as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around her wrists, binding her for corporate fraud and massive criminal conspiracy. Up on the stage, the reality of his absolute inescapable destruction finally broke Brad completely. He collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, weeping uncontrollably. He slowly turned his head, looking down into the shadows where my beautiful, innocent daughter was sitting perfectly safe. He began to slowly crawl toward the very edge of the stage, his extremely expensive custom tuxedo dragging pathetically across the carpet. He reached his shaking hands out over the edge, sobbing violently, begging Sarah for a shred of mercy that he absolutely did not deserve. Sarah stood up slowly from her secluded table in the shadows. The entire ballroom held its collective breath as she walked deliberately toward the brightly lit stage. She did not shed a single tear. The fragile, exhausted woman I had seen just moments ago was completely gone. In her place was a strong, unyielding force of nature who had finally seen the absolute truth. Brad looked up at her with desperate, pathetic eyes. He opened his mouth to offer another fabricated apology, to spin another web of toxic lies, but Sarah did not give him the chance to speak. With a swift, incredibly powerful motion, she raised her hand and delivered a slap across his face so hard that the sharp crack echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. His head snapped to the side and he collapsed completely onto the carpet. Sarah did not look back at him. She stepped right over his trembling body, walked down the short flight of stairs, and came straight into my open arms. I held my daughter tightly against my chest, kissing the top of her head. "I promised to protect you," I whispered softly into her hair, "and I always keep my promises." The federal agents did not waste another second. They hauled Brad roughly to his feet, ignoring his pathetic cries, and marched him firmly toward the main exit. Across the room, two more agents escorted a weeping Rachel out of the building. Richard and Patricia fought against their restraints, shouting arrogant threats about suing the federal government, but the agents simply pushed them forward with zero hesitation. The massive oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open to reveal a blinding sea of flashing camera lights. The financial press, who had been waiting outside to cover the prestigious corporate merger, were suddenly gifted the scandal of the entire century. They captured every single humiliating second as the disgraced chief executive officer, his corrupt mistress, and his incredibly arrogant parents were dragged out of the luxury hotel in heavy steel handcuffs. The same cameras Brad had wanted to impress were now documenting his absolute irreversible destruction for the entire world to see. As the heavy oak doors closed behind the disgraced executives sealing their terrifying fate, my eyes scanned the chaotic front row and locked onto the wealthy gray-haired man who had been sitting at the reserved table. It was the chief executive officer of our largest international competitor, the man who had gleefully walked onto my stage just moments ago to steal my life's work. He was currently standing frozen near the stairs, his face drained of all color, quietly trying to slip his tailored jacket off and blend into the panicked crowd. "Leaving so soon," I called out, my voice echoing sharply through the silver microphone. The rival CEO froze in his tracks, every camera in the room instantly pivoting to capture his terror. I walked over to the wooden podium, picked up the sleek leather-bound portfolio containing the fraudulent merger documents, and held it up high. "You thought you could execute a backdoor corporate takeover by negotiating with a desperate, thieving coward," I said, my tone dripping with absolute, unfiltered contempt. I gripped the thick stack of proprietary patents and tore them perfectly in half, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto the stage like worthless confetti. "Apex Industries is not for sale, and it never will be. If you ever attempt to manipulate my board or target my company again, I will personally ensure that your logistics empire is entirely dismantled and sold for scrap before the next fiscal quarter." The rival CEO swallowed hard, giving a short, terrified nod before practically sprinting out of the side exit, thoroughly humiliated in front of the entire financial press. Inside the ballroom, the elite crowd of billionaires and politicians remained perfectly still. I gently let go of Sarah and turned back to face the board of directors. Jonathan stood by my side holding the recovered financial ledgers. I addressed the room with a calm, commanding authority. "The criminal element has been completely removed from this company," I announced clearly. "Apex Industries is completely secure. The pension funds are entirely restored and effective immediately. We are undergoing a massive corporate restructuring. I suggest you all enjoy the rest of your champagne. We have a lot of honest work to do tomorrow morning. The era of unchecked corporate greed within these walls is officially over. We will tirelessly rebuild the extensive financial damage they caused, and we will do it one honest brick at a time." Later that night, the heavy adrenaline finally began to fade, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Sarah and I sat together in the back of the heavily armored federal transport vehicle, watching the rain-streaked city streets roll by in the quiet darkness. The flashing sirens and the suffocating chaos of the grand ballroom were finally far behind us. For a long time, neither of us said a single word. The silence was thick, heavy, with the incredible weight of the evening's devastating revelations. Finally, Sarah leaned over and rested her head on my shoulder, her hands trembling as she clutched my faded flannel jacket. The strong, unyielding front she had maintained on the stage finally cracked, and she wept. She cried for the years she had wasted, for the cruel psychological manipulation she had endured, and for the terrifying reality of how close she had come to losing her life on that mountain pass. I wrapped my arm tightly around her, resting my chin on top of her head. "I am so sorry I did not tell you the truth about the company," I whispered into the quiet cabin, my own voice breaking with long-suppressed emotion. "Your mother and I just wanted you to have a normal, happy life, completely free from the toxic burden of that money." Sarah looked up at me, wiping her tear-stained cheeks, and offered a small, broken, but incredibly genuine smile. "You saved my life, Dad," she said softly. "You built a fortress, and when the monster got inside, you tore the whole thing down just to protect me. You do not ever have to apologize for that. In that quiet transport vehicle, the last remaining walls of deception completely crumbled. We were finally just a father and a daughter again, ready to heal. We fade into a much quieter reality exactly 1 month later. The dark, stressful clouds of that chaotic night have completely dissipated. I am currently sitting on a worn wooden dock beside a peaceful, secluded lake located just a few miles outside of the city. I am wearing my exact same faded red flannel shirt, my rough denim jeans, and my scuffed work boots. I hold a simple fishing rod in my calloused hands, watching the calm water ripple gently under the warm afternoon sun. Sarah sits right beside me, holding her own fishing rod. She looks vibrant, healthy, and incredibly happy. The heavy, exhausting burden of her previous life has been entirely lifted from her shoulders. She leans her head against my arm, and we sit together in a comfortable, healing silence. The aftermath of the gala was swift and absolutely merciless. The federal prosecutors used the deep forensic evidence Jonathan uncovered to build an airtight, impenetrable case. Brad was officially charged with massive corporate embezzlement, extensive criminal conspiracy, and attempted murder. He is currently facing 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He sits in a tiny, cold, concrete cell, completely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his expensive watches. He will have decades to think about the $20,000 envelope he tried to force into my calloused hands. Richard and Patricia lost every single penny of their stolen offshore wealth. They were stripped of their luxurious estate, publicly disgraced in their high society circles, and are now serving lengthy prison sentences for their active roles in the massive financial fraud. Rachel struck a cowardly plea deal to avoid jail time, but her professional corporate reputation is completely ruined forever. Replacing a manipulative parasite with a genuine leader was my immediate priority. The following Monday, I secretly met with Elena Rostova, our newly appointed chief executive officer, in an inconspicuous diner on the edge of the city. Elena had started at Apex 20 years ago as a graveyard shift dispatcher and had ruthlessly worked her way up the corporate ladder through sheer brilliance and an unwavering ethical compass. She knew the names of the forklift drivers, she understood the complex logistics networks better than anyone, and most importantly, she possessed a spine of solid steel. Over black coffee and diner pancakes, I handed her the complete, newly restructured operational guidelines. Brad tried to sever the head of this company by bleeding the roots dry, I told her, sliding the thick dossier across the table. I want the roots heavily fortified. I want a complete independent audit of the pension funds every single quarter, and I want the results published directly to the warehouse floors. Absolute transparency. The workers need to know that their futures are untouchable. Elena looked over the documents, her sharp eyes reflecting a deep, respectful understanding of the immense responsibility I was handing her. "You have my word, William," she said firmly. "I am implementing a new profit-sharing initiative by the end of the month. The people who load the trucks are going to see the direct benefits of our success. The culture of elitism Brad built in the executive suites is completely dead. We are going back to being a real family." Knowing that the company I built was finally in the hands of someone who truly respected the weight of the crown allowed me to finally step back into the shadows with a completely clear conscience. Apex Industries is stronger than it has ever been. I appointed a highly intelligent, fiercely loyal female vice president to take over the role of chief executive officer. She is a woman who genuinely respects the hard-working blue-collar employees, and she has already implemented new security measures to ensure that the working-class pensions can never be tampered with again. I remain the anonymous chairman of the board, quietly guiding the massive global logistics empire from the comforting safety of the shadows. I do not need the public recognition, and I certainly do not need the stressful spotlight. We spend our beautiful weekends out here by the peaceful lake, far away from the greedy whispers of the city. We talk about the bright future, we share quiet laughs, and we simply enjoy the honest beauty of a perfectly normal day. I have my wonderful daughter. I have my quiet peace. And I have the absolute certainty that my family is finally safe. People often judge a man by the clothes on his back, the car he drives, or the dirt under his fingernails. They mistake a quiet, simple life for weakness, but greed has a funny way of blinding the arrogant. They always forget that the man who wears the oldest boots is often the one who poured the concrete they are currently standing on. Money can buy you a $250,000 watch, but it cannot buy you a soul, and it certainly cannot save you from the righteous wrath of a father protecting his only innocent child. Did this story keep you on the edge of your seat? Hit that like button to support a father who stood his ground. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is.